Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Inside Israel. I'm Joel Chasnoff. It's May 2nd, 2024. And tonight's episode is called Where the Fish Pisses. I know that's a really strange title for podcast episode. I want to explain where it comes from and give you a little context. There's a Hebrew expression. It's actually one of my favorite Hebrew expressions, eifo, hadag, mashtin, which means where the fish pisses, where the fish urinates. And the idea behind this expression is that, well, obviously, when a fish defecates, it does so right in the water next to him and poisons his own environment. And maybe the fish doesn't realize this at first, but eventually the fish will realize where he is pissing. All right, sorry to be crass, but I think it's a very apropos title for what we're about to talk tonight, which is I'm going to give you three stories of how reality might, in the end, come back and bite us or bite those who are trying to promote a certain narrative. The idea that people are taking action which they think is beneficial, helpful, good for themselves, the right thing to do, but in the end, it's just going to come back and harm them. And not surprisingly, we're going to start with the situation on college campuses in America. My intention when starting this podcast was to give you the news out of Israel, tell you what Israelis are thinking about. The assumption I always had was that I'd be telling you what's going on here in Israel itself. But I must say, one of the biggest news stories in Israel this week is what's happening at Columbia and then UCLA and Northwestern. You got to realize these are universities that many Israelis never even heard of. Maybe Columbia in New York, because Israelis tend to spend time in New York at some point after their army service. They go on a family trip. Northwestern in my hometown of Evanston, Illinois, I can't say that many Israelis were aware of Northwestern unless they were in academia or looking to go to school in the US. But now this is the big story in Israel right now. And I'll tell you this, when Israelis see students defacing school buildings at Columbia and rioting violently at UCLA, and that Northwestern is now offering full ride scholarships to Palestinian students who are quote unquote victims of Israeli oppression, Israelis say, Ot-oto yir'u efo hadag mashtin, meaning soon they will all realize where the fish pisses. They'll realize that in the end of the day, at the end of the day, these protesters and American society is going to be worse off for allowing these kinds of riots to happen, for allowing these students to dictate what happens on their campuses. And I shouldn't say it's only students, it's a lot of professors as well, which in a way might be even more frightening. But I want to make clear that this is not just a news story in the US that Israelis are oblivious to. Here in Israel, when you listen to the radio, and when you're in the car, you tend to listen to the radio. On the hour, on pretty much every station, they have a news brief. It's just part of life in Israel. It's a sort of news addicted to society. And on the hour, they give you a news update around the clock. And one of the lead stories, if not the lead story, every time these past few days, has been what's going on these campuses in America. So, what do Israelis think about it? I can tell you that we are horrified and really baffled. It's not like we feel these students are missing the mark a little bit, but maybe they have a small point. We see what they're doing as wildly, wildly wrong. It's a sign to us that they are completely ignorant, but beyond just ignorant, that they're standing up for the wrong side. They're completely in the dark. And we're trying to parse this out and figure out what exactly is behind this. Is it anti-Semitism? Is it anti-Zionism? Are those one and the same? A few things are becoming clear as we discuss this here, and it's probably becoming clear to you there as well. One is that this has been years in the making. This is not just something that suddenly began when October 7th occurred or when Israel went into Gaza, that this has been years and years building and in the making. And I actually looked this up, and it turns out that Qatar has been contributing to American universities. I'd offer you the chance to take a guess how much money they've given in the past 24 years, since 2001, to American universities. It's over $4.7 billion that Qatar has been contributing to U.S. universities and colleges. And what is that money going to? Well, some of it is actually funding Middle East departments at some of these universities, funding for certain professors. And what they've been doing slowly is changing the narrative on our campuses to the point where Israel and Israel's existence has become an idea that's toxic, one of these ideas up there with South African apartheid that must be abolished and cannot be tolerated. And we're seeing it come to a head right now. This is not something that began 6.5 months ago. It's years and years in the making. So that's one thing we're realizing. Now, our knee-jerk reaction might be that this is anti-Semitism. And I think it is to some extent. But there's something else happening here as well. When I talk to my American friends on campus, whether it's college students or adults who work with college students and high school students, I should say, this is now happening in high schools as well, including in Chicago, which is where I'm from. What I'm hearing a lot is that what this all comes down to at the end of the day is oppressor and oppressed. That for this generation, the high school students, the college students, the entire narrative is black and white. And I kind of mean that literally, that it is about the oppressor and the oppressed. Beyond that, nothing else matters. So once you're talking about a group of people who is oppressed, any tactics they utilize are justified. Kidnapping children, sexual abuse of women, taking citizens hostage. None of this registers as beyond the pale. None of this registers as horrific or not allowed because this is an oppressed people. And when you're oppressed, you must resist. This is resistance. And everything is in play when you are resisting. You know, I thought it was very telling that at one of the universities, and I forget which one it is, it might have been in Arizona. I think it was a school in Flagstaff, Arizona, maybe Grand Canyon University, but I'm not sure which one. But there was a school in Arizona where what the students were doing when they were protesting, they were part of their protest was they were in a circle doing Native American dances and chants. And I think this tells you the whole story right there. That if they are invoking the ideas of Native Americans in the US, this is what the narrative is to these college students and high school students. This is a narrative to them about an indigenous people, and I'm talking about the Gazans, the Palestinians, an indigenous people whose land was stolen from them, and they are simply resisting against the colonizer, Israel, in this case. That is how they're seeing it. So it's not strictly anti-Semitism. It's very much the paradigm of oppressor, oppressed, and the victims of colonization resisting against the colonizer. And they equate it with standing up for Native Americans in the US or standing up for African Americans in the US. There was a high school student in Chicago, a Jewish high school student who, in her high school, she wanted to have a vigil on October 8th or the week after October 7th. And the school, her high school, would not allow her to have this vigil. However, the school is allowing students to leave class and have these sit-ins against Israel and on behalf of Palestine and Gaza. And it's because they see this as part of resistance against colonization. And what this student said is that her fellow students have been verbally abusive to her, telling her that she's anti-Black and anti-Native American. It's all part of this paradigm in the US where everyone is lumped together. I think it's called, right, intersectionality, where if you're against one, you're against all, and all minorities are the same and in the same situation. What adds to it is the idea in many of these students' minds is that the Israelis are white and the Gazans are Black, and so that adds to the narrative. Now, where does the anti-Semitism piece come in? It's actually I think it's very interesting and clever. And I'm going to refer to two books which I highly recommend to help make sense of it. One is Barry Weiss's book, How to Fight Anti-Semitism. Barry Weiss was a writer for the New York Times, and then she left the Times and founded Free Press. And in her book, she talks about how one of the core tenets of anti-Semitism is that in any society, the most abhorrent quality at that particular time is attributed to the Jews. That's what anti-Semitism is. So in this sense, anti-Semitism is very different from bigotry and racism against other groups. When you look at other groups who have been persecuted, who've had racist uh, ideas thrown at them, it's pretty much consistent what we say about these other minority groups. But with Jews, it's very fluid. It's chameleon-like. It adapts to the times. So in capitalist societies, Jews are the communists and the socialists. In communist societies, Jews are the capitalists and the colonizers. Whatever the most abhorrent quality is at that time, it's attributed to the Jews. And right now, we are living in an era where colonizing others, oppressing minorities, specifically dark minorities, is the number one abhorrent quality in American society, at least among the younger population. And so this is being attributed to Jews. And this is why it's anti-Semitism, is because this fluid quality, this fluid accusation is being stigmatized, put on Jews when it's not put on others. I find this really ironic because I have a close family friend whose son is applying to colleges right now, and one of the schools he looked at is George Washington University in DC, and they went to a big assembly a couple months ago where they gathered all these potential incoming freshmen to introduce them to the school. And the very first thing they did in this large assembly um, was read a declaration that said, "We realize that we are sitting on land that once belonged to such and such tribe of the Native American people, and this land was taken from them, and we acknowledge that we are on it." And then they moved on with their with their assembly, with their program. This is just so fascinating to me because on the one hand, they realize that they too are guilty of this crime that they are accusing Israel of, and yet they are in no way willing to take any steps against themselves. You don't see any of them saying, "And we will vacate this land," or "We will give this land back." They're just saying, "We realize we stole it. Now let's go on with our welcome to GW ceremony." And I've seen this myself, as I've mentioned this before on this podcast, that when I travel around the US, if I have a free night, I'll go to a concert, a show, I'll check out the culture in town. And especially in the Pacific Northwest, before any event starts, someone gets up on stage and acknowledges which Native American tribe this land has been stolen from, and then the program goes on as if there's nothing at all to worry about. So it is obviously utter hypocrisy, but it's anti-Semitism when we stigmatize the Jews for it and we call them out and hold the Jewish people to a standard that no one else is being held to. So that's another thing we're sort of digging into right here. Now, the other book I want to refer to is Dara Horn's book, People Love Dead Jews. And the premise of her book is that people actually are okay with the Jewish people as long as we're victims. People call it abhorrent when 5 years ago, 5.5 years ago, Jews are gunned down at a synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, because we're victims, and it fits into the narrative of what Jews are supposed to be, that we're supposed to be victims. And we're living right now in the age of oppressor oppressed, and also in the age of the victim. This is the era of victimization. And so people are fine with Jews as long as they're victims. But once Jews start standing up for ourselves, once we start fighting back, or God forbid, actually winning, then people aren't so happy with Jews anymore. And that is the premise of Dara Horn's book. And, I want to hone in on this idea of victimhood. And let's look at these college students and high school students as well. This is a generation who, in my opinion, thrive on being victims and looking at themselves as victims. Uh, it's a level of, and what I might be saying right now might upset some of you, but I'm just going to go ahead and be blunt for no reason not to. This is a generation that prides themselves on being upset that they are not allowed to have the right type of bathroom for them. They're very anxious. They are upset that they don't have enough time to take their standardized tests for college because of the anxiety they have. I have a friend who works in college admissions at Tufts University, and he told me that the number of requests that high school students are putting in to have extra time on their entrance exams because they have anxiety and other victim-like issues that don't allow them to cope with the stress of taking a standardized test. It's He's never seen anything like it in all of his years working in admissions. We saw this at Columbia University, where the leader of the student protest, Joanna King-Slutsky, was demanding humanitarian aid and food and water for the students who took over Hamilton Hall on Columbia's campus. They broke windows. They took hostage some security guards, wouldn't allow them to leave. And then they have the gall to ask for food and water and humanitarian aid because they want to be victims. This is a generation that sees themselves as victims. They lived through COVID. COVID was part of their high school or middle school experience. And they identify highly with victims, the idea of victimhood, and they don't like to see themselves as anything but victims. They don't like to see themselves in power. And I think a lot of Jewish students, the ones who are participating, that is why as well. They're uncomfortable with the notion of Jews standing up for themselves. They'd rather attach to the older idea of victimhood, the one Dara Horn speaks about in her book, People Love Dead Jews. So as we're trying to sort this out, what's happening on campuses, yes, Israelis are noticing. Yes, we are horrified and appalled, but we're also trying to understand exactly what is going on here. And I think it's not simply anti-Semitism, but it's not just the colonialism and anti-colonialism stance either. It's this weird mix, and it also has to do with the psychology of this people. But a lot of Israelis do feel that ototo yiru eifo hadag mashtin, that eventually they are going to see where the fish pisses, uh, that if politicians in America allow this to happen, that if university presidents and boards allow this to happen, their universities' reputations could be stained. I think they already are. We could see, I think this could be a drastic change for the Democratic Party in the US if they keep associating with these kind of, if you want to call them protests, I don't even call them protests, but if they keep associating with it and allowing it and calling it free speech and freedom of expression, I think, for a long time, it's ironic. Biden was worried that if he wasn't strongly enough against Israel, that he could lose a lot of the progressive vote. I'm starting to think that if he keeps continuing on the path he's on right now, he could lose a lot of the Jewish vote. I know a lot of Jews, including myself, who've always voted Democratic and who are now suddenly thinking, wow, I don't know if I can vote Democratic anymore if this is where the party is going and this is what the stance is. I don't want to get too deeply into politics, but when we talk about the consequences and coming back to bite us, um, this could be a bit of a bellwether. This could change a lot of things in American society. And I'll tell you this, it's hard to live in Israel. It can be hard to raise kids in Israel, but I am glad I'm here. I wouldn't want to have to send my kids to college in the US right now. So the second story I want to talk about relating to reality coming back to bite you, is Bezalel Smotrich. Bezalel Smotrich is the finance minister here in Israel. And he came out very strongly this past week against the idea of making a deal with Hamas, a deal which would maybe allow for the release of 33 Israeli hostages or 22 Israeli hostages. We're not exactly sure what the number is. If it would mean ending the war in Gaza and not going into Rafiah, which is the southernmost city in Gaza, in which we sort of feel here in Israel that we would need to go into if we are actually going to finish off Hamas once and for all. And I want to read you what Bezalel Smotrich says, and then I'll address it. Smotrich said, "My heart is torn by the suffering of the hostages and their families, but my head is thinking at the same time about the future of 9 million Israeli citizens and how they will be affected by a potential return of Hamas to northern Gaza and the release of terrorists with blood on their hands. That's why it personally would be easiest for me as a public figure and politician to support any deal at any price. I would receive applause from everyone, from the families of the hostages, from the media, from the international community. But in the end, my responsibility is to the public, to my conscience, and to the truth. And the head and the truth say that such a deal must be opposed because its results would be disastrous. It would mean the surrender of the state of Israel." And this deal that he's talking about, like I said, would allow for the release of between 20 and 30 hostages, but it would mean that there would be, I think, a 6-week pause in the fighting, maybe a 40-day pause, and that Gazans would be allowed to return to northern Gaza, perhaps without even undergoing a security check by Israel, which means that Hamas could go there as well. Now, if you've been with me on these podcasts since October, you'll know that I am not a big fan of Bezalel Smotrich. I think he's extreme. He's way too right-wing for me. I've had a lot of negative things to say about him. But in this case, I want to be honest. There's a lot that I agree with in what he said in this statement, and a lot of Israelis feel the same way. Smotrich received a lot of criticism in the Israeli media for saying what I just read to you. Gadi Eisenkot, who's a member of the War Cabinet and a former chief of staff, and whose own son was killed in Gaza, and his own nephew was killed in Gaza, Eisenkot came out and said that this was political blackmail, because one of the things that Smotrich said is that he was willing to pay the ultimate price and leave the government, which would lead to the collapse of the government, instead of allowing this bill, this deal to go through with Hamas, that he would not support it and he would leave the government as a way to sabotage the agreement going through. And Gadi Eisenkot called this political blackmail. But I gotta say, even though I don't usually support Smotrich, I really do respect him here for speaking what I think is the truth. Because what he is saying here is that if we go through with a deal like this, ototo yiru eifo hadag mashtin, we would see where the fish pisses. This could come back and harm us ourselves. And why do I say that? Well, we remember what happened when Gilad Shalit, the Israeli tank soldier, was released in 2011 after 5 years in Hamas captivity. We released over 1,000 prisoners, Palestinian prisoners, many had blood on their hands. I think over a third of them had committed murder against Israeli Jews. We released them in exchange for one Israeli soldier. And many of those went on to murder Israelis again. The head of the brain behind the October 7th attack is Sinwar. And he was released. He was sitting in an Israeli jail in 2010. But we released him as part of this deal to get Gilad Shalit back from Gaza. And what Smotrich is saying here is that, yes, there are maybe 20 or 30 hostages we could get out now, or there are 130 hostages that we could get out in total. But he is thinking of all the other future Israelis that we need to protect as well. What he's saying is how many future Israeli Jews or Jews around the world could be murdered if we release over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners, many of whom have blood on their hands. And that is one of the stipulations of this newest proposal that Israel put forward to Hamas. Now, in a way, he need not worry because Hamas has rejected that proposal, last I checked, unless there's news in the last hour. But the point is that he's saying we can't just think about the bodies in Gaza right now, the hostages in Gaza right now. We have to think about all the future potential victims. And our duty is to protect Israeli citizens, not just who are in Gaza right now, but in the future, down the road. And he's one of the few who's willing to actually pay a political price in order to keep Israel safe. And I want to tell you, he received a lot of criticism for making this statement, but he speaks for many, many Israelis. You know, we see a lot of images in the media here in Israel of families of hostages blocking the highways and protesting the government. And you could get the idea that the entire public wants nothing more but a deal that would release all the hostages, even if it means ending the war. From the media coverage here, that is sort of the impression you would get. But if you talk to the average Israeli on the street, almost all of them, except for the families of hostages themselves, would tell you that we need to finish this war, that we need to go into Rafah, this southern city in Gaza, and finish the job against Hamas. I talked to the family of a soldier this week, a soldier in a very elite unit called Sayeret Golani, and he had been serving in Gaza since on and off since October 7th. And I said, well, what is he telling you about the situation there? Are we winning? Are we doing okay? And the family said, are you kidding me? Not only are we winning, but we're destroying Hamas. Hamas is no match for the Israeli army. We're dismantling them. And I said, well, then why are so many Israelis worried about how the war is going and talking about, or why is the media so concerned about how the war is going and whether or not we're actually winning? And they said, well, in the media, what we're seeing here are the very, very sad stories about the soldiers who have died in Gaza, which is now, I think, 265. We're hearing about all the soldiers who are injured, which is a horrific number, thousands permanently injured for life, and 10,000 cases of PTSD that we're ultimately expecting from IDF soldiers. Those are the stories we're hearing. But what we are not hearing is how we are dismantling one battalion after another of Hamas. So when Smotrich speaks about not having a deal that would allow Hamas potentially to return to northern Gaza, he is speaking for many, many Israelis, myself included. I think one of the problems with Smotrich and some of these other right-wing politicians and a lot of Israeli politicians is that they don't know how to deliver the message diplomatically. They're a little too Israeli in the way they convey the message. They speak too bluntly. You know, I remember Ariel Sharon when he was asked about civilian casualties in wartime. Ariel Sharon is the late prime minister of Israel and former IDF high up officer, perhaps chief of staff. He said, to make an omelet, you need to break a few eggs, which may be true, but that's just not what you say when you're talking to American media about civilian casualties in war. We don't, in Israel, tend to phrase things beautifully. And I think Smotrich might have a little more success in conveying his message if he were able to be a little more diplomatic and soft and less Israeli and blunt in the way he puts his message forward. But many, many Israelis agree with him. So when Bezalel Smotrich says that he's thinking about the future of 9 million Israeli citizens and how they will be affected by the return of Hamas to northern Gaza, even though Smotrich isn't personally popular with a majority of Israelis, many, including myself, understand what he means and even agree with him because the war cannot end until we have finished off Hamas. The third story I want to bring to you is about the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox. As you know, that this has been an ongoing issue since really for the last few months, that the Israeli public is rising up and saying it is time for the ultra-Orthodox to serve in the Israeli army. Last year alone, more than 60,000 ultra-Orthodox young men received exemptions from serving in the IDF. Meanwhile, soldiers who are in the Israeli army are having their service time extended from 2 years, 8 months to 3 years. Others are being drafted early. They're having their high school gap year programs ended early so that they can draft into the army in June instead of in August and September. And the government was ordered by the Attorney General and the Supreme Court to start drafting the soldiers, to present a plan for how to draft the soldiers on March 31st. And they delayed that again until mid-April and then until May 1st. And now they have asked for yet another extension. So the government continues to kick the can down the road. And this might be keeping the government together right now. This might be saving Bibi Netanyahu. How does this save him? Well, he needs the right-wing ultra-Orthodox parties to keep his government intact. And if he begins drafting ultra-Orthodox soldiers into the IDF, believe me, his government will collapse. So in the short term, this could be good for him. But in the long term, this could certainly poison his own political career, but also harm the Likud party as well. And that's where this idea of where the fish urinates comes into play, that the short-term benefit will be outweighed by the long-term harm. This could be an issue, by the way, that I think really tears Israeli society apart, and that ultimately could be the issue that brings down the Israeli government. Because with 265 IDF soldiers killed in Gaza so far, thousands injured permanently, over 2,000 expected to apply for services related to PTSD. Israelis want the ultra-Orthodox community to do their part. They want them to participate, to bear their part of the burden, and not just leave it to the rest of us the way that they have for the past 75 years. So those are the three narratives I wanted to share with you. But here's 3.5. Here's one more idea I want to point out. How strange is it that less than 3 weeks ago, Israel was attacked by Iran from Iranian territory, and no one's talking about it? This is not the lead story. If this had happened at any other time in the past 10 years in Israel, this would be all we are talking about, that Iran had launched over 300 projectiles, drones, ballistic missiles at Israel. No one's even speaking about that. And I think in the US, barely anyone is talking about that here. It just strikes me as kind of odd, but also is very Israeli that we move on so quickly and deal with the next tragedy or the next story as it comes. I find that interesting, though. All right, some news from the week. So Israel has presented some very, very generous deals to Hamas that would allow for hostages to be released. I wouldn't even call them generous. I think a lot of Israelis are calling them too extreme, maybe even cockamamie. I mean, we're talking about over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners released from jails. Like I said, many with blood on their hands have murdered Israelis, allowing Gazans to return to northern Gaza, perhaps even an end to the war itself, in exchange for between 20 and 30 hostages. Now, right now, it's believed that of the 133 hostages in Gaza, probably only 70 are alive. But many Israelis believe that it is time for, if we're going to have a deal, for one deal that brings them all home. I'm pretty sure even the family of Hirsch Poland, John and Rachel Poland, are calling for one deal. Not this segmented deal where first it's the women, the elderly, and the sick, and then it's men over a certain age, and then it's men of soldier age. We have to see them all as our people and our responsibility. In this idea, it's angering many Israelis that we are offering so much for only small pieces of the hostages that we have in Gaza right now. And like I said, in a way, we need not worry because the latest news that I heard last night is that Hamas rejected this deal as well. And I understand why. You'd have to ask, why would they accept it? How would they benefit by accepting a deal? I mean, look what they're getting right now. They're getting peak levels of humanitarian aid being brought into Gaza. Look at the unrest they're sowing in the United States, this upheaval on college campuses. They're destabilizing the whole American political system as Biden gets criticism and Trump now has this new weapon to use against Biden, and the Democratic Party is becoming ever more pro-Palestinian, pro-Gazan, even pro-Hamas. I mean, they're getting exactly what they want, and the world is turning on Israel. Israelis, and this is going to be the next story I talk about, Israelis are being warned not to show their Israeliness when they go out in public in other countries, to tuck in any Stars of David or necklaces, to not speak Hebrew too loudly. What more could Hamas want? They're achieving everything they need. So why should they negotiate anything right now? The one reason they would negotiate a deal is to stop the destruction of Rafah and to stop the killing of more Gazans. But they want this too. They want Rafah to be destroyed. They want more Gazan civilians to die because this makes Israel look even worse. So the idea that Hamas is rejecting even this last proposal is not surprising to me at all. And you can go back and listen to past episodes of this podcast. I've told you all along I don't expect a deal to happen because it's not in Hamas's interest to have one. And by the way, the U.S. knows this. The U.S. is saying that Hamas is the obstacle to any deal right now. And as they're saying this, the U.S. is saying that there would be a ceasefire if Hamas would simply accept the deal that Israel is putting forward. And at the same time they're saying this, college students are erupting against Israel for the fact that there's not a ceasefire and what we're doing to the Gazans. It's simply baffling, but also very, very scary. So that's the first piece of news, that Hamas is rejecting this latest deal. Second, like I told you, that Sweden, well, this is the more specific angle, Sweden has upped its level of threat to a level 3 for the upcoming Eurovision contest, meaning that they have intelligence, credible intelligence, that there might be some sort of terrorist attack taking place during the Eurovision contest, which I believe begins on May 7th through the 11th. They have credible intel that it would be against Israelis. Israelis this week were warned by the Israeli Home Front Command Division of the Israeli army not to travel to Sweden to reconsider their plans for attending Eurovision. That if they must go, they are told to, like I said, keep any signs of being Israeli on the quiet, to not walk around with Israeli flags, to not speak Hebrew loudly, which made me laugh when I heard that because, Israelis kind of don't know how to talk quietly. So I'm not sure how possible that is, but Israelis are being encouraged that if they do go to Sweden to not be shouting in Hebrew, but only to talk quietly amongst themselves in Hebrew. And one reason that the threat level was raised to a level 3, which is a moderate threat of violence against Israelis, is because the city where Eurovision is being held in Sweden, Malmo, is the home to many Arab immigrants. So they feel that, especially in this city, the threat would be high because of the large Arab population that is there. And this relates to an idea I've brought up before in this podcast, that many European countries won't admit it out loud, but they regret that they have allowed so many refugees from Muslim countries into their own countries. And they're scared of the violence. We see it in Germany, the way these populations have risen up against the German police, and they're scared of this kind of violence now in Sweden as well. And I think there are regrets, and I think that's one of the reasons that a lot of these governments are not so outwardly supportive of Israel, is they're afraid of what their own populations might do. But I find this extremely sad that in the year 2024, Israelis cannot safely fly to the Eurovision contest and cheer on our singer. Now, I should point out that the singer, I believe her name is Eden Golan, she has her own security detail, but she has been told not to leave her hotel except for the contest itself. So even she is being warned not to wander about, that she needs to stay in her hotel room for her own safety. This is the world we're living in. And I should remind you also that we have an Olympics coming up this summer. I'm pretty sure that once Eurovision is over, we'll start talking about the Olympics and what's going to happen in terms of threats there as well. The final story I want to bring up in the news here, this is probably one that you are not hearing about in the US and Canada or outside of Israel. It's the idea that many Israelis are urging politicians in Israel to stay away from Yom HaAtzmaut ceremonies, Yom HaAtzmaut and Yom HaZikaron ceremonies. The Yom HaZikaron is Israeli Memorial Day. It's very, very heavy here in Israel. It's not like Memorial Day in the US where people do picnics and parades and swimming pools open. Memorial Day in Israel is an extremely somber day. It is a day of tears. There's a siren twice where we stand in complete silence and remember the soldiers and victims of terror who've been taken from us. And this year, all the more so, it is going to be a heavy day. But one tradition is that Israeli politicians speak at Yom HaZikaron, Memorial Day cemeteries, whether it's Memorial Day ceremonies, whether it's in cemeteries or at other public events. And many Israelis are urging politicians to stay away. They're asking the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, to just issue a blanket order to politicians not to speak at these Yom HaZikaron Memorial Day ceremonies because it would be too contentious and too political. And what we need right now is unity in Israel and not divisiveness. But that's a little input into where Israelis are right now. Just one other little story I want to finish with before I go to the questions is that out of the United States, the White House press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, said that the U.S. is considering different ways to bring families of Gazans to the United States. So if there are Americans living in the U.S. Of Palestinian descent who have family in Gaza, the U.S. is looking for ways to bring these Gazans to the United States to settle in the US. And my question is, I'm just very curious to see how all these American protesters feel about that. And I'm not saying this in a racist way, but just in a very blunt way. I'm curious how all these protesters would feel about the prospect of thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of Palestinians being resettled in their neighborhoods, on their turf, in their schools, and their communities. I'm curious if they'd be as into it as they are these protests, or maybe if they'd realize that they don't want to actually have the fish pits so close to them. I think a lot of these protests are based on the assumption that it's somebody else's issue and someone else's problem. But if Gazans were to be resettled in their own communities, I'm wondering if they would think twice. All right, on to your questions. Judy from Boston said, there's a lot of speculation that Qatar is behind the protests at U.S. colleges. What do you know about this? Well, as I mentioned earlier, yes. It's been found that in the past 24 years, Qatar has put in $4.7 billion into U.S. colleges. A lot of that money has gone to bringing in Middle East founding Middle East history departments, supporting certain professors. I also think that they're playing both sides because on the one hand, Qatar does want to be part of the new world. You know, Qatar hosted the World Cup just a couple of years ago. They see themselves as a country that's going to be part of the world moving forward, but at the same time, they are housing Hamas's leaders. So yeah, they are playing both sides. But I think we're also realizing how big a role Qatar has been playing in these protests on campus. And you know, another thing you're seeing in the news there is it's not just college students. A lot of these people are paid protesters, lifetime protesters who are stirring up the violence on these campuses. And these, I'm sorry, but idiot students kind of fall for it, hook, line, and sinker, to bring another fishing metaphor into today's discussion. I think also one thing that's becoming clear is that these universities are businesses. It's quite sad, but they are for sale. So, we like to think of our colleges as institutions of higher learning, but at the end of the day, so much of it is about the money and the endowment and how much they can bring in. And a lot of these universities have simply been sold off to the highest bidder. Naomi writes, I live in New York City, and I'm frustrated at the lack of a unified response from the Jewish community to what's happening at Columbia University. The only rallies I know about are organized by Israeli groups advocating for the release of hostages. Last Friday, several hundred Jews showed up outside Columbia to demonstrate. However, the only message was about the hostages and bring them home, nothing about holding Hamas accountable. Where are the U.S. Jews? And Naomi, I so agree with you. And I've talked about this many times before. You got to hand it to the other side. One thing the other side always manages to do is to stay unified. They have one message and they stick to it. And there is no waffling and there is no hand wringing. They just push the one narrative forward and they're all behind it. And we Jews are not like that. And part of it, you might say, is that we just can't get our act together. But part of it is, I think this is our DNA. This is what makes us Jews. We are a people who argues and debates and wrings our hands. And this is our gift to the world. The Talmud is one question that's answered with another question that leads to even more questions. We're questioning people. But the downside of that is that we can't get on the same page. And we really, right now, need to get on the same page. We have this horrible habit of airing our dirty laundry in public. We need to stop doing that. A lot of organizations I've talked to have said that there should be another organization who does this. So some are saying, yeah, this is where the ADL needs to step in, and others are saying this is where UJA Federation should step in. This is APAC that should come up with a plan. We have all these organizations, but there's no one who's really tasked with solving what's happening on the campuses now and the anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiment in North America in general. And this is a problem. I've said for a while that the Jews need a pope, that we need one leader to sort of get us in line, at least instruct us on what our messaging should be. And this leader can say, go ahead, argue amongst yourselves about what we should be doing, what we should be saying. But in terms of our messaging to the world, we need to be unified. A few names that came to mind. I would love to see Yossi Klein Halevi. And if you don't know who that is, just Google his name. And he has some excellent books. For example, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. I mean, I would love for Yossi Klein Halevi to be the voice of reason of the Jewish people and get us in line. Or maybe a board, like a small committee consisting of Yossi Klein Halevi and Daniel Gordis and Barry Weiss, who I mentioned earlier, and Dara Horn. Let's get those four in a room and have them be tasked with the idea of messaging for the Jewish people during these times. Then we can argue amongst ourselves about ethics and what land, and we can wring our hands. But in public, we need to present this unified stance. I would love to see that. I think we need to get more unity. And Naomi, I agree with you. That said, I don't think it'll happen because so many of these organizations, these Jewish organizations, also have their own agendas, and the different movements of Judaism all want to stand for a certain thing as opposed to just standing for Israel. It's we stand for Israel, but allowing Gazans to do X, Y, and Z, or not allowing Hamas to do Y. We all have our own agendas, and the strength of the other side is that there is no hand wringing. They are unified in their message, and I think we could learn something from them. Final question. Jerry in Ohio says, summer is coming up. In past episodes, you've talked about summer Israel trips. how participation is at this point down. So first, where are those numbers now? And second, what do Israeli kids do during the summer? Are they starting to plan? I love these kind of questions that actually give you a little insight into Israeli society. So the first question first, where are those numbers right now? I happened to speak to someone just yesterday about summer trips to Israel, and it's still it was where they were before, 90% down. Typically, 5,000 Jewish teens come to Israel from North America, and right now we're looking at about 1,000. It could be that that number has gone down even more. I had a conversation with someone from the Camp Ramah movement, and Camp Ramah last summer had about 280 signed up for their summer Israel trips. This summer they have about 180, so they're down 100, roughly a third. And the other thing that this person mentioned regarding Camp Ramah is that even during Iran's missile attack, he was receiving emails from parents saying, we're canceling, we want our deposit back. That as Iran was attacking Israel and the missiles were in the air, he was receiving cancellations. So you can understand why this would be a very tough summer to get teens to come to Israel. I think parents see this as a very dangerous time to send their kids here. That said, there are those who are coming. Ramah happens to be the strongest movement in terms of numbers. One reason is they have changed their itinerary drastically. They will be going to the north, but only for a little bit. They're not going to the Golan Heights, not going to the Galilee. They're going south, but they are not doing visits to the Nova rave site. They're mostly going to be in the center of Israel, and this has reassured parents. But even with that, their numbers are down quite a bit. So second part of the question, what do Israeli kids do during the summer? Are they planning yet? And the answer is no, we're not planning yet. Israelis tend to figure out the summer in the end of June when school is just about letting out. I know this must sound really strange to those of you in the US where you start filling out forms for summer camp in October, but it's much more loosey-goosey and laid back here in Israel. School goes until June 30th, pretty much nationwide. So right around June 20th, 21st, we start thinking, oh, what might my kid do during the summer? And we'll even send our kids to camp on the first day of camp without having officially signed him or her up, and just sort of show up with the kid and tell the director, yeah, I want to enroll him. There's no medical forms. You know, I remember in the US when I would go to Camp Ramah, I had all these medical forms I had to fill out and paperwork. There's no medical form you need to fill out here. I don't think you even have to sign a piece of paper. You just pay the deposit or agree to pay the deposit and give your name and phone number, and guess what? Your kid's in camp. And camp is typically from about 9 in the morning till 1 in the afternoon, and then they come home. There is overnight camp in Israel, but it's not a very big phenomenon at all. You know, you have the scouts at Sofim. They'll have a 1 week overnight camp experience here somewhere in Israel. But the idea of going away to camp for 3 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, that might happen here. Like in rare cases, there might be one or two camps like that, but most kids either are going to some sort of day camp, some go to school, like the school will open a sort of a supervised session where the kids go to school, but they just play on the playground, and teachers are hired for the summer to sort of sit there and watch them, but there's no real activities. But a lot of time is just spent at home. It's not a very intensive summer camping society, and we tend to sign them up at the last minute, like so many things happen here in Israel, doing it by the seat of our pants. I want to thank everyone for joining tonight. Next week's episode of Inside Israel will be once again on Thursday night. I will be back in the US for that one. I'm leaving this Sunday for a trip to the United States, doing some shows around Yom HaAtzmaut, Israeli Independence Day, and I'll be touring next Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday nights. So the next episode of Inside Israel will be next Thursday. That is May 9th at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. You can get the links for that the same place you can get all the information about this podcast. I just put it in the chat, which is joelchasnoff.com, and go to the podcast page. That's where you can sign up for my newsletter, Hebrew is Magic, and that is when I send out the link for these meets. Please share them with other people. If you think there are folks who want this kind of personal inside scoop on what it's like to be Israeli and live in Israel right now, please share the show with them. Also, what really helps me is that if you give this show a rating on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify, that is the best way to help get word about the podcast out there. And that's just at joelchasnoff.com/podcast. I put that link right there in the chat as well. Email me your questions ahead of time. That's always the best way to get your questions in. I look forward to seeing you next week. And obviously, I hope that there will be good news by then. You never know, but let's hope for it. Until then, lehitraot, shalom to us all. I'll leave the chat open for a few more minutes so you can talk amongst yourselves. Thanks for joining. Signing off from Israel. Laila tov.